Hello everyone, and welcome back to our channel, where we bring you face to face with figures from the past and talk about their history. Today we're looking at one of history's most formidable power couples, Queen Isabella I of Castile and King Ferdinand II of Aragon. Their union didn't just join two kingdoms, it forged the nation of Spain, launched an age of global exploration, and unleashed a period of terrifying religious persecution. But were they pious visionaries who saved their country, or were they ruthless fanatics whose ambition created an empire built on a foundation of intolerance? So let's go ahead and get started. To understand Isabella and Ferdinand, you have to understand the world they were born into. The late 15th century was a chaotic and violent time in Europe. It was a messy patchwork of rival kingdoms, duchies and city-states, all vying for power. And nowhere was this more true than on the Iberian Peninsula. The Spain we know today simply didn't exist. Instead, the peninsula was divided into several Christian kingdoms, most importantly, the large and wealthy Castile and the coastal trading power of Aragon. And in the south, holding on by a thread, was the last remnant of Muslim rule in the region, the Emirate of Granada. For centuries, the Christian kingdoms had been fighting a slow, grinding war to reconquer the peninsula from the Muslim Moors, a conflict they called the Reconquista. This constant state of warfare shaped their culture, their politics, and their intense militant form of Christianity. In the powerful kingdom of Castile lived a young princess named Isabella. Her path to the throne was anything but certain. She lived in the shadow of her unstable half-brother, the king, and saw firsthand how quickly fortunes could turn. By all accounts, she was incredibly intelligent, strong-willed, and possessed a deep, almost fanatical religious piety. It must have been a lonely and dangerous childhood, knowing that any political shift could mean her ruin or her rise. Meanwhile, in the neighboring kingdom of Aragon, there was an equally ambitious young prince, Ferdinand. He was known for his sharp political instincts and his cunning. While Isabella's kingdom was larger and more populous, Ferdinand's Aragon was a maritime power with influence across the Mediterranean. He saw the chaos in Castile and recognized an opportunity. A marriage between the two was a political masterstroke. It wasn't a love match. It was a merger of two ambitious people who saw that together they could achieve what neither could alone. They were second cousins, so they needed the Pope's permission to marry, and when he hesitated, they simply forged the papal document and got married anyway. This one act tells you so much about them. They were driven, willing to bend any rule, and utterly convinced of their own destiny. Together, they would become known as the Catholic monarchs. This wasn't just a fancy title, it was a mission statement. They believed they were chosen by God to unite their fractured lands under a single crown, and most importantly, a single faith. But to do that, they first had to deal with the powerful, unruly nobles who threatened their authority and then turned their attention to the last Muslim kingdom on the peninsula. Their shared vision would reshape Spain and the world, but it would come at a terrible, bloody price. With their power in Castile and Aragon slowly solidifying, Isabella and Ferdinand turned to the next great duty of any monarch, securing the future of their dynasty. Over the next decade, they would have 5 children who survived to adulthood. Their heir was a son, John, and they had 4 daughters, each one a valuable political asset to be married off into the great royal houses of Europe. But it was their 3rd child, a daughter named Juana, born in 1479, who would become one of the most tragic figures of the age. From a very young age, it was clear that Juana was exceptionally gifted. By all accounts, she was the most intelligent of all their children. She received a stellar education, mastering Latin, French, and several other languages, and she was accomplished in music, dance, and philosophy. Like her mother, she was also deeply, intensely religious. She was everything a Renaissance princess was supposed to be: cultured, pious, and brilliant. But there was another side to Juana, a shadow that ran alongside her bright intellect. She was a child of extreme emotions. Her passions were fierce, her attachments were absolute, and she was prone to long, dark periods of melancholy. It's easy to imagine Isabella and Ferdinand, two of the most pragmatic and calculating rulers in history, looking at their passionate, sensitive daughter with a mixture of pride and concern. They had created a perfect political pawn, but they had given her a soul that was dangerously fragile. This combination of fierce intelligence and emotional intensity would come to define her entire life. And in the cold, hard world of 15th century politics, a passionate heart was a liability that could lead to absolute ruin. As the third child and second daughter, Juana was never supposed to be queen. Her older brother John was the Prince of Asturias, the undisputed heir to the Spanish throne. Her older sister, Isabella, was the spare. This meant that Juana's future, and the futures of her younger sisters Maria and Catherine, was not to rule, but to be used. For Isabella and Ferdinand, their daughters were not just family, they were the most valuable pieces on a vast European chessboard. Their grand strategy was to encircle their primary rival, France, by weaving a web of alliances through marriage. Each daughter was a thread in this web, a diplomatic envoy whose womb would secure a treaty. The eldest, Isabella, was married to the heir of Portugal. The youngest, Catherine, was betrothed from infancy to the heir of England, a boy named Arthur Tudor. And Juana, their brilliant, intense and beautiful second daughter, was assigned the most important match of all. She was to be married to Philip of Habsburg, the son of the Holy Roman Emperor Maximilian I. Philip, known across Europe as the Handsome, was the heir to the wealthy and powerful Burgundian Netherlands, and was in line to inherit the vast Habsburg lands that dominated Central Europe. A union with him would be the cornerstone of Isabella and Ferdinand's anti-French alliance. It's hard to imagine what this must have felt like for the teenage Juana. She was a person of deep feelings and fierce attachments, and yet her entire future was a political calculation. She was to be sent away from her home, her family, and everything she had ever known to marry a complete stranger in a foreign land. For her parents, this was her sacred duty to God and Spain. For Juana, it must have been a terrifying and lonely prospect. The match was made, her fate was sealed. So, this grand plan of theirs had a name. It's often called the Habsburg strategy, and it was one of the most ambitious pieces of political engineering in European history. The goal was simple, and it was all about one kingdom, France. For Isabella and Ferdinand, the map of Europe was a giant chessboard, and their great rival, the King of France, was sitting right in the middle. Their strategy was to put him in check from every possible direction, and their 5 children were the pieces they would use to do it. The plan was breathtaking in its scope. To the west, they secured their border by marrying their eldest daughter, Isabella, to the heir of Portugal. This was meant to eventually unite the entire Iberian Peninsula under their family's rule. To the north, their youngest daughter, the now famous Catherine of Aragon, was sent to England to marry the Tudor heir, creating a powerful anti-French ally across the Channel. And then there was the masterstroke, the double marriage alliance with the powerful Habsburg family. We already know that Juana was sent to marry Philip the Handsome, heir to the Netherlands and the vast Habsburg lands. But at the same time, their own son and heir, Prince John, was married to Philip's sister, Margaret of Austria. It was a perfect, symmetrical trap. Spain and the Holy Roman Empire, the 2 greatest powers in Europe, were now tied together by blood, completely boxing France in. For me, this is what is so incredible about Isabella and Ferdinand. It wasn't just 1 or 2 political marriages. It was a continent-spanning web of dynasty and power. They were playing a game that would take decades to unfold, sacrificing their children's personal happiness for the future of Spain. It's hard not to be impressed by the sheer audacity of it, even if it feels incredibly cold. On paper, the plan was flawless. It was a fortress of alliances built to last for generations. But they had forgotten one crucial variable that no monarch, no matter how powerful, can ever control: tragedy. And so, In August of 1496, the first move in this grand continental game was made. A fleet of over 100 ships set sail from Spain, carrying the 17-year-old Juana to her new life in Flanders. It's hard to even imagine what she must have been feeling. She was leaving behind the only home she had ever known, sailing into a cold, northern sea to marry a man she had never met. For a young woman of such intense emotions and deep attachments, the journey must have been an agony of loneliness and fear. When she finally arrived, she was met by her betrothed, Philip of Habsburg, and in that moment, everything changed. Philip was, by all accounts, breathtakingly good-looking, earning his nickname, the Handsome. But it was more than that. When he and Juana met, there was an immediate electric connection. The story goes that they were so instantly and overwhelmingly attracted to each other that they couldn't even wait for the planned ceremony. They demanded to find the nearest priest and be married on the spot. For Juana, who had lived her whole life as a political calculation, this must have felt like a miracle. This wasn't a duty, it was a passion that consumed her entirely. She fell completely and utterly in love with her husband, with an intensity that startled the Burgundian court. For a brief, shining moment, it seemed like the cold, calculated plan of her parents had accidentally created one of the great love stories of the age. But a passion this fierce has a dark side. Juana's love was absolute, possessive, and all-consuming, and she expected the same from Philip in return. Unfortunately, for a man like Philip the Handsome, faithfulness was not a priority. But while Juana had found the love of her life, she had also found herself in a world that was completely alien to her. The journey from the docks to the heart of Flanders was more than just a trip across the country. It was a journey into a different reality. The court of Flanders was nothing like the severe, pious court of her parents in Spain. This was the Burgundian court, the wealthiest and most extravagant court in all of Europe. It was a glittering world of lavish feasts, constant tournaments, and fashions that would have been considered scandalous back home. It was a place famous for its vibrant arts, its rich culture, and its very, very relaxed morals. It's hard to overstate what a shock this must have been for Juana. You have to remember, she was the daughter of the Catholic monarchs, raised in a world of strict religious devotion, modesty, and austerity. Her life in Spain had been quiet, structured, and intensely spiritual. For a young woman of her intense piety, this new world of open flirtations and casual affairs must have felt like landing on another planet. It wasn't just foreign, it was fundamentally opposed to everything she had ever been taught to value. And at the very center of this glittering, licentious world was her husband, Philip the Handsome. He was the product of this culture, and he thrived in it. He loved the attention, the flattery, and the endless stream of admirers who flocked to him. His charm wasn't just for his wife, it was for everyone. For Juana, this must have been terrifying. She had given her entire soul to one man, expecting that same absolute, undivided devotion in return. But she had married a man who belonged to everyone. And so, the stage was set for a collision. On one side, you had Juana, a woman of absolute, all-consuming love, who believed her marriage was a divine, exclusive passion. On the other, you had Philip, a man who saw flirtation and admiration as his birthright, and a court that actively encouraged it. At first, their passion for each other was so intense that it seemed to eclipse everything else. They were inseparable. The Burgundian court was treated to the spectacle of a royal couple who were genuinely, madly in love. For Juana, who had spent her entire life as a political pawn, this must have felt like a miracle. The cold, calculated marriage her parents had arranged had turned into the one thing she had always craved, a true, soul-deep connection. But it couldn't last. Philip was a product of his environment, and his eyes inevitably began to wander. He was charming, he was handsome, and the ladies of the court were more than willing to offer him their attention. For him, these were probably meaningless flirtations, the casual sport of a popular and powerful prince. For Juana, it was a betrayal of the highest order. She did not react with quiet sadness or dignified anger. Her response was as fierce and as passionate as her love. The stories from court describe public confrontations, furious accusations, and fits of jealous rage that shocked the courtiers. They were used to casual affairs, but they were not prepared for this raw, unfiltered emotion from a Spanish princess. It's easy to imagine the horror and betrayal she must have felt, watching the man she had given her entire world to casually give parts of himself away to others. And for me, this is where the tragedy of Juana really begins to take shape. The very intensity that made her love so profound was now being seen as instability. Her fierce loyalty was being painted as obsessive madness. The court didn't see a heartbroken wife defending her sacred marriage. They saw a hysterical foreigner who didn't understand their ways. The fairy tale was over. And so, the pattern was set. The initial, beautiful passion of their marriage began to curdle into something else entirely. It became a destructive cycle of obsessive love, furious jealousy, and desperate, tearful reconciliations. Juana's love for Philip was the absolute center of her universe. You have to remember, she was completely isolated. She was in a foreign land, surrounded by a court she didn't trust, and her only anchor in this glittering alien world was her husband. He wasn't just the man she loved, he was her entire reality. So, any attention he gave to another woman wasn't just a minor betrayal, it was a fundamental threat to her very existence. For Juana, every casual flirtation must have felt like a physical blow. Her devotion became all-consuming. She reportedly followed him everywhere, unable to bear him out of her sight for even a moment. She needed constant reassurance of his love, a reassurance that a man like Philip was either unwilling or simply unable to give. For Philip, this must have been incredibly suffocating. At first, her intense, all-encompassing passion was probably flattering. He was the sole object of this brilliant, beautiful princess's affection. But soon, that flattery must have felt like a trap. He was a prince who was used to being admired, used to the freedom and casual flirtations of courtly life. And now his wife, this intense Spanish princess, was watching his every move, questioning his every word. Her love had become a cage. And the more she tried to hold on to him, the more he pulled away. His flirtations became more open, almost defiant. For me, it's easy to see this as simple cruelty, and maybe it was. But it also looks like the desperate actions of a man trying to escape a love that was smothering him. He would provoke her, and she would react with furious public outbursts, which only served to confirm to the Burgundian court that she was unstable. It was a vicious, heartbreaking cycle. Her desperate need for his love drove him away, and his distance made her even more desperate. They were trapped in a destructive dance, and it was a dance that would ultimately destroy them both. But this destructive cycle wasn't just a private tragedy playing out behind closed doors. It was about to become a very public spectacle. Philip, feeling smothered by Juana's obsessive love, no longer bothered with subtle flirtations. He began to pursue affairs openly, almost as an act of rebellion. He wasn't just being unfaithful, he was being cruel, flaunting his infidelities in a court that was all too happy to watch the drama unfold. And Juana's reactions grew just as public and just as volatile. The stories that began to leak from the court were shocking. In one famous incident, Juana, consumed by a jealous rage, physically confronted one of Philip's presumed lovers. She didn't just scream at the woman, she reportedly attacked her, cutting off her beautiful hair with a pair of scissors. It's an ugly image, and it's easy to see it as simple madness. But you have to try to see it from Juana's perspective. For her, this wasn't just a catfight. It was a desperate public battle for what she saw as the sanctity of her marriage. In her mind, she was a queen defending her throne from a usurper. But to the gossiping courtiers of Burgundy, She was just a hysterical foreigner making a scene. And for Philip, and the ambitious nobles who surrounded him, this was more than just embarrassing. It was useful. Her public outbursts, born of heartbreak and betrayal, were now being carefully framed as proof of her instability. Every tear, every accusation, every desperate attempt to hold on to her husband was another piece of evidence that could be used against her. Her passion was being weaponized against her. Slowly but surely, a new narrative was being built around the Spanish princess. She wasn't just passionate or difficult, she was irrational, unhinged. The whispers started to solidify into a reputation. The damage was done, and a new, terrible name was beginning to attach itself to her. Juana la Loca, Juana de Mat. But while Juana's personal world was collapsing into a cycle of jealousy and rage in Flanders, back in Spain, the grand, flawless plan of her parents was about to shatter. You have to remember, Isabella and Ferdinand had built a fortress of alliances, a perfect political machine designed to secure their legacy for generations. Juana was just one part of that machine, and not even the most important one. The first blow came in 1497, and it was the most devastating one imaginable. Their only son, their heir, Prince John, suddenly died of a fever. He was just 19 years old. For Isabella and Ferdinand, this wasn't just a political disaster. It was a personal heartbreak that, by all accounts, nearly broke the Queen. All their hopes had rested on him. His young wife, Margaret of Austria, was pregnant at the time of his death, but a few months later she gave birth to a stillborn daughter. The first pillar of their dynasty had crumbled into dust. With John gone, the line of succession passed to their eldest daughter, Isabella, the Queen of Portugal. The plan, though damaged, was still intact, but just a year later in 1498, tragedy struck again. Isabella died while giving birth to her own son, a boy named Miguel. Now their heir and their spare were both gone. All hope now rested on this tiny infant. For a brief, shining moment, it seemed like an even greater destiny was at hand. Little Miguel was now the heir to Castile, Aragon, and Portugal. The dream of a united Iberian peninsula was embodied in this one small child. But, in the year 1500, the unthinkable happened. The 2-year-old prince fell ill and died. John was dead. Isabella was dead. Miguel was dead. In the space of just 3 years, the entire line of succession had been wiped out, and so the crown had to pass to the next in line, their second daughter, the one they had married off to the Habsburgs, the one whose husband was ambitious and whose reputation for instability was already echoing across the courts of Europe. Suddenly, Juana was the heir to everything. And so, with the line of succession in ruins, a message was sent north to Flanders. Juana, the daughter they had sent away as a political piece, was now the heir to all of Spain. She and her husband Philip were being summoned home to be officially recognized. For Philip the Handsome, this was the moment he had been waiting for. He wasn't just the Duke of Burgundy anymore. He was on his way to claim the rich and powerful kingdoms of Castile and Aragon. By all accounts, he travelled through France not as a guest, but as a future king, with a massive, extravagant entourage that was designed to show off his wealth and power. But when they finally arrived in Spain in early 1502, the reception was cold. The Spanish court, shaped by decades of Isabella and Ferdinand's austere piety, was shocked by Philip's flamboyant Burgundian style. They saw him as arrogant, frivolous, and worst of all, foreign. He didn't speak their language, he dismissed their customs, and he surrounded himself with his own Flemish advisors, treating the Spanish nobles with open contempt. And Philip made no secret of his intentions. He didn't see himself as Juana's consort, a prince waiting in the wings. He saw himself as the rightful ruler. He immediately began trying to build his own power base, charming Spanish nobles and promising them positions and influence. For me, this is where you see his true character. He wasn't there to support his wife. He was there to take her inheritance. It's hard to imagine what Isabella and Ferdinand must have thought, watching this unfold. They were two of the most cunning political operators in European history, and now they had to watch their arrogant foreign son-in-law try to seize control of the kingdom they had spent their entire lives building. And worse, they were seeing their daughter Juana caught in the middle, torn between her obsessive love for her husband and her duty to her parents and her country. Despite the simmering tension, the formalities went ahead. Juana and Philip were officially sworn in by the courts of Castile and Aragon as the Prince and Princess of Asturias, the heirs to the Spanish throne. On the surface, it was a moment of dynastic triumph. But everyone could see the truth. The threat to Spain was no longer an outside enemy like France. The greatest danger was now inside the family, in the form of their own ambitious son-in-law. And Isabella, in particular, was beginning to realize that the daughter she had sent away had come back with a husband who might just destroy everything. Philip had been in Spain for well over a year, and he absolutely hated it. The formal, severe, and deeply religious court of his in-laws was a prison compared to the vibrant, freewheeling world he had left behind in Flanders. He missed the parties, the tournaments, the flattery, and the freedom. He was a king in waiting, but he felt like a guest who had overstayed his welcome, constantly watched by the shrewd eyes of Isabella and Ferdinand. So, in the winter of 1502, he made a decision. He was going home. He announced his intention to return to Flanders, leaving his wife behind to act as his representative in Spain. For Juana, this news was a catastrophe. She was pregnant with their fourth child, and the thought of being separated from Philip was unbearable. You have to remember, her love for him was the absolute center of her existence. It was obsessive, all-consuming, and the only thing that gave her life meaning. She begged him not to go. She pleaded. She wept. She promised anything if he would just stay with her. But her pleas fell on deaf ears. For Philip, this wasn't about leaving his wife. It was about escaping her. Her desperate, clinging love had become a cage, and he was determined to break free. Her tears and her frantic promises were not, to him, the signs of a heartbroken woman. They were just more proof of the instability he had been complaining about for years. He left her anyway. The effect on Juana was immediate and devastating. She was left behind, pregnant, in a court that now saw her as the abandoned wife of a flighty, untrustworthy foreigner. Her grief was absolute. By all accounts, she fell into a deep and inconsolable depression, refusing to eat or speak, spending her days staring out of the window of the castle, waiting for a husband who was not coming back. For the Spanish court, and for her increasingly worried parents, this wasn't the understandable heartbreak of a young wife. It was a terrifying confirmation of all the rumors that had followed her from Flanders. Her profound grief was seen as madness. And for her mother, Queen Isabella, who was already in failing health, it must have been a horrifying realization. The daughter she had sent away to secure a dynasty had returned broken, and the future of Spain now rested on the shoulders of a woman who was losing her grip on reality. And for Queen Isabella, watching her daughter's public breakdown was the final, heartbreaking tragedy of her life. She was old, she was sick, and she was watching the powerful, unified Spain she had built with Ferdinand Tita on the brink of chaos. She had to secure the future, but her heir was a woman consumed by a grief that everyone was calling madness. In November of 1504, the end finally came. Queen Isabella the Catholic, one of the most formidable and consequential rulers in European history, died. An entire era of Spanish history died with her. She had forged a nation, sponsored a new world, and enforced her will with an iron piety. And now, her final act would be to write a will that would determine the fate of her daughter and of Spain itself. On the surface, the will was exactly what everyone expected. It named her daughter, Juana, as her rightful successor and Queen of Castile. After all the tragedy and death, Juana's birthright had finally come to pass. She was now the queen. But Isabella had included a clause, a single devastating sentence that would become a weapon in the hands of the men who wanted to control her daughter. The will stated that if Juana was unwilling or unable to rule, her father, Ferdinand, should govern in her name until her own son came of age. For me, this is the moment that seals Juana's fate. Her own mother, in a desperate attempt to protect Spain from what she saw as her daughter's instability, had just given her enemies the legal justification they needed. The rumors of Juana the Mad were no longer just court gossip. They were now the key to a kingdom. All Ferdinand, or Philip, had to do was prove that she was unable to rule, and her power would vanish. The trap had been set. With Isabella gone, Ferdinand didn't waste a single moment. He was in Spain, he had the will, and he had a daughter who was visibly lost in her own grief. He immediately invoked the clause his wife had so fatefully included. He pointed to Juana's profound depression, her refusal to eat, her long, silent vigils staring out the window, and declared that she was clearly unable to rule. He was now the governor and administrator of Castile, ruling in his daughter's name. But back in Flanders, Philip the Handsome heard the news of his mother-in-law's death, and he had no intention of letting his father-in-law steal his prize. He immediately began styling himself King Philip I of Castile. He argued that, as Juana's husband, he was the rightful ruler, not her father. He started gathering allies and preparing to sail to Spain to claim what he saw as his kingdom. And so, the battle lines were drawn. On one side, you had Ferdinand, the old, cunning king, already on the ground in Spain, holding the legal document that gave him power. On the other, you had Philip, the young, arrogant prince, backed by the might of the Habsburgs, ready to challenge him. And where was Juana in all of this? She was the Queen of Castile, the person whose birthright this was. But in reality, she was a prisoner. She was a prisoner of her own overwhelming grief, and now she was a pawn caught between the two most powerful men in her life. For me, it's this moment that is the most heartbreaking of all. Her father and her husband weren't fighting to support her. They were fighting over who got to rule instead of her. A father and a husband were now at war over a daughter's crown. The battle for Castile had begun. But this wasn't a war that would be fought with swords and cannons. It was a war of whispers, of rumors, and of propaganda, with Queen Juana's sanity as the battlefield. Both her father and her husband now began to actively and cynically weaponize her emotional state, each for his own gain. Ferdinand, already in Spain, had the advantage. He controlled access to Juana, and he used her very real and visible grief as his primary evidence. He could point to his daughter, lost in her sorrow, and present it to the Castilian nobles as proof that she was, as the will had suggested, unable to rule. He kept her isolated, which only deepened her depression and made her appear even more withdrawn and unstable to any who saw her. Every tear she shed was a justification for his power. But Philip, back in Flanders, was a master of presentation. He couldn't deny Juana's distress, so he simply changed the narrative. He began circulating his own story, that Juana was not naturally unstable, but had been driven to this state by the cruelty of her father. He painted Ferdinand as a greedy tyrant who was holding his own daughter prisoner to steal her crown. In his version of events, he was the loving, heroic husband, preparing to sail to Spain to rescue his beloved wife from her tormentor. And for me, this is the most cynical part of Juana's story. Her father and her husband were both looking at the same heartbroken woman, and both saw nothing but a political tool. Ferdinand used her grief to prove she was mad. Philip used her grief to prove her father was a monster. Neither of them seemed to be concerned with the actual, suffering human being at the center of it all. Her pain had become their political ammunition. It's hard to imagine what this must have felt like for Juana, if she was even aware of the specifics. Her most private, profound feelings of love and loss were being twisted into public relations campaigns. She was the Queen of Castile, and yet she had no voice. She was just a symbol, an argument to be won. The war of words was about to escalate. Philip was gathering his ships and his allies. He wasn't just going to send letters anymore. He was coming to Spain to claim his wife and her kingdom. And so, in the spring of 1506, Philip made his move. He didn't just sail to Spain with a few advisors and a claim to the throne. He arrived on the coast of Castile with a massive army of German mercenaries. This wasn't a negotiation, it was an invasion. He wasn't coming to ask for his wife's kingdom, he was coming to take it by force. The effect was immediate. The powerful nobles of Castile, who had grown tired of Ferdinand's heavy-handed rule and were eager for a change, saw which way the wind was blowing. They saw Philip's army, they saw his youth and his promises of power, and they began to abandon the old king in droves. Ferdinand, for all his cunning, found himself suddenly isolated and outmaneuvered. He could try to fight, but it would mean plunging Castile into a civil war against his own son-in-law and the majority of his own nobles. The old king had been outplayed. Faced with a choice between a humiliating retreat and a disastrous war, Ferdinand chose to retreat. He met with Philip and, in a series of tense negotiations, agreed to surrender control of Castile. He would withdraw to his own kingdom of Aragon and leave his daughter's inheritance in the hands of her husband. For me, this is the moment the tragedy becomes absolute. Juana was now finally the undisputed Queen of Castile, reunited with the husband she adored. But she was a queen in name only. She was a political ghost, her signature used on documents, but her voice completely silenced. Her father had abandoned her, and her husband, the man she had sacrificed everything for, now ruled her kingdom as if it were his own. She had won, and in doing so, she had lost everything. And so, for a few short months, it seemed that Philip the Handsome had won everything. He was the undisputed master of Castile, with his wife, the true queen, little more than a signature on his documents. The Spanish nobles flocked to his side, and his father-in-law, Ferdinand, was a distant memory back in Aragon. Philip was young, he was powerful, and he was at the absolute peak of his triumph. But in September of 1506, just 5 months after arriving in Spain, the 28-year-old king was in the city of Burgos. After a long, hot game of pelota, a bit like tennis, he drank a large glass of cold water. That evening, he developed a high fever. The illness came on with a terrifying speed and violence. Within days, it was clear that he was not going to recover. The official cause was recorded as typhoid fever, but in a world of such high political stakes, a death this sudden and convenient was bound to raise suspicions. On September 25, 1506, Philip the Handsome was dead. For Juana, the news was an absolute, world-shattering catastrophe. She was just 26 years old, pregnant with their 6th child, and now a widow. The man who had been the single, all-consuming focus of her entire adult life, the object of her obsessive love, her jealous rages, and her complete devotion, was gone. For me, it's impossible to even imagine the kind of grief she must have felt. Her father had abandoned her, and now the husband she had given her kingdom for had been taken from her too. The kingdom of Castile was now in chaos. Its queen was a young, pregnant widow, lost in a grief so profound that it was indistinguishable from the madness everyone already believed she possessed. The strong, arrogant hand that had held the country was gone, and a power vacuum had just opened up in the heart of Spain. And in the face of this power vacuum, Juana's grief became her entire world. She refused to leave Philip's side. For days, she stayed with his body in the cold, dark room, not eating, not sleeping, just watching over him, as if her vigil alone could bring him back. The court was paralyzed, watching their queen, a pregnant widow, consumed by a sorrow so profound it looked like a waking nightmare. The nobles and clergy urged her to allow for the funeral. It was time to bury the king, but Juana refused. For her, this was an unthinkable act of finality. If his body was not in the ground, then he wasn't truly gone. He was just sleeping. She would not be separated from him. He was not to be buried. Instead, she gave a new, shocking order. She would take him with her. And so began the most infamous and macabre chapter of Juana's legend. She had Philip's body embalmed and placed in a lead coffin, and then she set out from Burgos, beginning a slow, wandering funeral procession across the Castilian countryside. For 8 long months, this became her life. The procession travelled mostly at night because, as Juana apparently declared, a widow who has lost the son of her own soul should not be seen in the light of day. Her jealousy, it seems, had not died with her husband. She forbade the procession from ever stopping at a convent or any place where women were present, terrified that even in death, another woman might steal his gaze. And periodically, she would order the coffin opened so she could look upon his decaying face, as if to reassure herself that he was still there. For me, this is the moment where the legend of Juana the Mad is truly forged, not by her enemies, but by her own heartbreaking actions. It's easy to dismiss this as pure insanity, but you have to try to understand the psychology of it. This was a woman whose entire existence had revolved around one man. This procession wasn't just a refusal to let go. It was the only way she knew how to continue being his wife. As long as she was with his body, her life still had its purpose. The people of Castile could only watch in horror and awe as this ghostly parade, led by their grieving, pregnant queen, snaked its way across the plains. The rumours that had once been court gossip were now a public spectacle. She was no longer just the passionate princess or the abandoned wife. She was Juana la Loca, the mad queen, wandering the wilderness with her husband's corpse. And all the while, her father, Ferdinand, was watching from Aragon, waiting for the perfect moment to return and pick up the pieces of his daughter's broken kingdom. It's so easy to look at this story of the queen and the corpse and just write her off as completely insane. And honestly, who could blame you? A pregnant widow, dragging her husband's coffin across the country at night, terrified that other women might look at him. It sounds like something out of a gothic horror story. It's the perfect tragic final chapter for Juana the Mad. But what if it wasn't just grief-fueled madness? What if, underneath all that horror and heartbreak, there was a desperate political calculation at play? Because when you look at the situation she was in, this bizarre procession starts to look less like insanity and more like a last desperate move in a political chess game. You have to remember, Juana was not just a grieving widow. She was the Queen of Castile, and she was pregnant with the heir. Her father, Ferdinand, was waiting in Aragon, ready to use the instability clause in Isabella's will to seize power. In the 16th century, the physical body of the king was a potent symbol of legitimacy. As long as Juana had Philip's body, she had the symbol of power. She was reminding everyone that she was the king's widow and the mother of the future king, not just some hysterical woman to be pushed aside. For me, this completely reframes the entire procession. It stops being a simple act of madness and becomes a desperate and, frankly, quite clever political act. She was using the only asset she had left, her dead husband's body, to physically occupy the role of monarch. She couldn't rule from a palace because her court had abandoned her. So she ruled from the road, with the symbol of her authority right there in the coffin beside her. It was a desperate, brilliant gambit. She was trying to hold the kingdom together through sheer force of will until her child was born, securing the throne for the next generation. But it was never going to work. The spectacle was just too strange, too macabre. Instead of reminding the nobles of her legitimacy, it only confirmed their worst fears. It gave her father, Ferdinand, the perfect excuse he needed. He wasn't just coming back to save a chaotic kingdom. He was coming back to save his poor, mad daughter from herself. And so, Ferdinand's moment had finally arrived. The horrifying spectacle of his daughter's funeral procession had done his work for him. The nobles of Castile were terrified, the people were bewildered, and everyone was desperate for a return to order. He no longer had to look like a power-hungry tyrant. He could return as a concerned father and a responsible king, coming to save his poor mad daughter and her chaotic kingdom. In August of 1507, he finally met her on the road. It's hard to imagine what that meeting must have been like. Juana, exhausted, and having just given birth to her and Philip's last child, was finally confronted by the father who had abandoned her. Her desperate, macabre political theatre was over. For Juana, it must have felt like the final, crushing defeat. The last piece of her independence, the body of her husband, was about to be taken from her. Ferdinand acted swiftly. He had the support of the nobles, he had the justification of his daughter's very public breakdown, and of course, he had his wife's will. He officially declared Juana unable to govern. He was now the regent of Castile, ruling in her name. Her brief, tragic and chaotic reign was effectively over. But he couldn't just leave her to wander the countryside. She was still the queen, and her son was the future king. She had to be controlled, so he gave his final order. Juana was to be taken to the royal palace of Tordesillas, a castle that also housed the convent of Santa Clara. It was a fortress, a palace, and a prison, all in one. For me, this is the most chilling part of the story. He wasn't just imprisoning her. He was burying her alive in a gilded cage, with her youngest child as her only companion. She would never be free again. And so, the gates of the palace at Tordesillas closed behind Juana. This wasn't a dungeon with chains and rats. It was a royal palace, a gilded cage where she was surrounded by servants who were really her guards. She was stripped of all political power, all contact with the outside world. She was a queen who received no news, signed no documents, and spoke to no one of authority. She was a ghost in her own kingdom. Her only companion in the long, silent years to come was her youngest daughter, Catherine, the child born after Philip's death. The little girl grew up in that suffocating silence, her entire world confined to the palace walls, her only playmate, a mother lost in a fog of grief. It's hard to even imagine what those years must have been like for Juana, watching her daughter grow up in a prison, knowing that the world outside was moving on without her. Years passed. Ferdinand ruled Castile as regent, and Juana was all but forgotten. But then, in 1516, Ferdinand died. Her father, her jailer, was gone. For a moment, there must have been a flicker of hope. Surely now she would be freed. Her eldest son, Charles, was now a young man. He had been raised in Flanders, and he came to Spain to claim his inheritance as King Charles I. He visited his mother at Tordesillas. It was the first time they had seen each other in over a decade. He needed her to officially grant him co-rule, to legitimize his power. But once he had her signature, he made his decision. And for me, this is the final, most heartbreaking betrayal in Juana's entire story. Her own son, the boy she had fought to protect, saw her not as a mother to be rescued, but as a political problem to be managed. He saw the same instability his grandfather had, and he feared she could become a rallying point for rebellious nobles. He ordered the confinement to continue. Her own son had become her new jailer. The hope of freedom was gone forever. The world moved on. An empire was being built in her name. But for Juana, the Queen of Spain, nothing would change. The walls of Tordesillas were her entire world, and they would remain so for the rest of her life. And so we come to the great, unanswered question that sits at the heart of this entire story. Was Juana la Loca truly mad? For 500 years that name has defined her, turning a queen into a caricature, a tragedy into a ghost story. But was her madness a clinical reality, or was it the most successful character assassination in European history? On one hand, it's easy to see why the label stuck. Her behaviour was, by any measure, extreme. The public, jealous rages, the reported physical attack on her husband's mistress, and of course, the horrifying, macabre funeral procession across the plains of Castile. Even today, this behaviour would be seen as deeply unstable. It's not a huge leap to see a woman who was, at the very least, suffering from a profound and debilitating mental illness. But on the other hand, you have to look at who benefited from her being seen as mad. Every single powerful man in her life had a direct political reason to amplify and weaponize her emotional state. Her husband, Philip, used it to sideline her and rule in her place. Her father, Ferdinand, used it to invoke his wife's will and seize the regency of Castile. And finally, her own son, Charles, used it to justify her continued imprisonment and secure his own, undisputed claim to the throne. It was all just so incredibly convenient. Incredibly. For me, the tragedy isn't in choosing one side or the other. It's in realizing that both are probably true. Juana was almost certainly a woman of extreme emotions, likely suffering from what we might now call severe depression or another mood disorder, triggered and worsened by unimaginable grief and betrayal. She was a woman in profound, legitimate pain. But that pain was never met with compassion. It was met with political calculation. Her very real suffering was seen as a weakness, an opportunity, and it was ruthlessly and cynically exploited by her husband, her father, and her son. Her real tragedy wasn't that she was mad, but that her suffering was more useful to her family than her recovery ever would have been. So, if we want to get to the bottom of this, we have to start by looking at the evidence itself. Most of what we know about Juana's supposed madness comes from primary sources, letters and reports written by the people at court who saw her every day. But here's the problem. These weren't objective observers writing in a private diary. These were ambitious courtiers, and their reports were almost always written for an audience of one, the man who was in charge. Think about it. If you're a courtier serving Philip the Handsome, and you know he's trying to build a case that his wife is unstable so he can rule in her place, what kind of report are you going to write? You're going to write about her outbursts, her tears, her jealousy. You're going to emphasize everything that makes her look irrational, and you're going to conveniently leave out the parts where she's calm, intelligent, or making a perfectly valid point. For me, this is one of the most chilling aspects of her story. She was living in a fishbowl, surrounded by people whose job it was to document her every flaw. Every moment of human weakness, every tear shed in grief, was potentially being recorded, twisted, and used as a weapon against her. These letters weren't evidence of her madness. They were applications for a promotion. And this pattern of biased reporting didn't just happen with Philip. It continued with her father, and then with her son. The narrative of Juana the Mad was a story that was useful to them, and so it was the story their courtiers told, time and time again. So, the written record from her own time is deeply unreliable, a funhouse mirror reflecting the ambitions of the men around her. But the story of Juana the Mad didn't just stay in the dusty archives of the 16th century. It would be resurrected hundreds of years later, in a form that was far more powerful and lasting than any courtier's letter. In the 19th century, during the height of the Romantic era, artists and writers became obsessed with stories of tragic passion, doomed love, and beautiful, suffering heroines. And in the story of Juana, they found the perfect subject. The most famous and influential of these works is a massive painting from 1877 by the Spanish artist Francisco Pradilla Ortiz. It's simply titled Queen Joanna the Mad, and it is, for me, the single most powerful piece of propaganda in this entire story. It depicts Juana, dressed in black, standing defiantly in a desolate, windswept landscape. Her hair is wild, her expression is a mixture of grief and fury, and behind her is the coffin of her husband, Philip. Her courtiers huddle together in the background, looking cold, bored, and indifferent to her suffering. It is a masterpiece of romantic tragedy, and it cemented the image of Juana la Loca in the popular imagination forever. This wasn't a complex historical figure anymore. She was a beautiful, tragic madwoman, a gothic heroine defined by her obsessive love and her spectacular grief. This was the image that stuck. It was printed in books, it was copied by other artists, and it became the definitive, visual truth of who Juana was. It was more immediate than a letter, more emotional than a history book. It was a story you could understand in a single glance. The historical reality, with all its political calculation and cynical betrayal, was washed away. All that was left was the beautiful, heartbreaking fiction. But that powerful romantic image is just that, an image painted more than 300 years after her death, based on a legend. So what did the real Juana look like to the people of her own time? What do the portraits painted during her life actually show us? When we look at the few contemporary portraits that survive, the picture is completely different. There is no wild-eyed madwoman, no disheveled hair, no gothic fury. What we see is a serious, pious-looking young woman with the long face and prominent jaw that would become the famous Habsburg chin. She looks reserved, maybe a little sad, but who could blame her? There is absolutely nothing in these paintings to suggest a mind in turmoil. And for me, this is one of the most powerful pieces of the puzzle. If Juana was so famously and publicly unhinged, you would expect at least some hint of it to be captured by the artists of her day. But there's nothing. Just a queen. The later dramatic paintings are like a game of historical telephone. They aren't portraits of Juana. They're portraits of the legend of Juana, with each artist adding a new layer of tragedy and madness until the original person is completely gone. They don't show us what she looked like. They teach us how to look at her. They teach us to see madness in a face that might just be showing grief. They teach us to see instability in a woman who was simply powerless, trapped by the ambitions of the men who controlled her life and her image. The visual record from her own time is a blank slate, offering no clear diagnosis, leaving us with the chilling possibility that we have been taught to see a madwoman where there was only a heartbroken queen. So, let's set aside the question of Juana's sanity for a moment and look at the man who benefited most from her supposed madness. Her father, Ferdinand. Why was he so ruthless? Why would a father imprison his own daughter for the rest of her life? The simple answer is that his actions had very little to do with being a father. They had everything to do with being a king. You have to understand the political map of Spain at the time. While Ferdinand's own kingdom of Aragon was a significant Mediterranean power, it was Castile, his late wife's kingdom, that held the real key to the peninsula. Castile was larger, more populous, and far wealthier. It was the engine of their shared power. For Ferdinand, the idea of letting his daughter and her foreign-born Habsburg husband rule Castile was not just a family matter. It was a strategic catastrophe. For me, this is the absolute key to understanding his motivations. He and Isabella had spent their entire lives fighting to unite Spain, to bring the unruly nobles to heel, and to forge a single powerful nation under their control. Letting Philip the Handsome take over Castile would undo all of it. It would hand the ultimate prize to a foreigner who had nothing but contempt for Spain, and it would shatter the unity he had worked so hard to build. His daughter's inheritance had become a direct threat to his own legacy. He had built Spain, and he would not let his own family be the ones to tear it down. But it wasn't just about strategy or the fear of a foreign king taking over. For Ferdinand, the threat of losing Castile was about something much more simple and much more powerful. It was about money. You have to understand, Castile wasn't just the bigger kingdom, it was the bank. For centuries, its coffers had been swelling with revenue from a massive and lucrative wool trade that dominated the European market. But now, a new, world-changing stream of wealth was beginning to pour in. The first wave of gold and silver from the New World, from the lands Columbus had claimed for them, was arriving in Castilian ports. And Ferdinand needed every last coin. He was a king with vast and expensive ambitions, most importantly, his costly and ongoing wars in Italy, where he was fighting the French for control of Naples. These wars were the centerpiece of his foreign policy, and they were bleeding his own kingdom of Aragon dry. He needed Castile's money. And this, for me, is the cold, hard reality at the bottom of this whole tragedy. If Philip the Handsome, a Habsburg prince, controlled Castile, he would control its treasury. That incredible wealth wouldn't be flowing to Ferdinand's armies in Italy. It would be diverted to Habsburg projects in Flanders or Germany. Ferdinand's entire foreign policy, his life's work, would collapse overnight. So when Ferdinand looked at his daughter, the rightful Queen of Castile, he didn't just see a political problem. He saw a hand reaching for his wallet. Keeping control of the Castilian treasury was paramount, and the only way to ensure that control was to make sure its rightful queen could never, ever rule. It wasn't just about power or legacy. At the end of the day, it was about cold, hard cash. Ferdinand had secured Castile's money and its power by imprisoning its queen. For most men, this would have been enough. But Ferdinand was not most men. He was playing a much longer game, and he knew that as long as Juana's Habsburg son, Charles, was his heir, the future of Spain was ultimately out of his hands. He needed a different solution, a permanent one. And so, just over a year after his wife Isabella's death, the 53-year-old Ferdinand did something that shocked all of Europe. He remarried. His bride was an 18-year-old French princess named Germaine de Foix. It's a move so cold, so cynical, it's almost hard to believe. He had spent his entire life fighting the French, and now he was marrying one. But this wasn't about love or even diplomacy. It was about biology. Germaine was young, and he needed her to do one thing: give him a son. For me, this is the most ruthless and revealing act of Ferdinand's entire life. His plan was breathtakingly simple and breathtakingly cruel. If he and Germaine had a son, that boy would inherit Ferdinand's own kingdom of Aragon. But Ferdinand could then argue that this new Spanish-born son should also inherit Castile, completely disinheriting his own daughter Juana and, more importantly, his Habsburg grandson Charles. He was willing to tear Spain in two, to undo the life's work he had built with Isabella, all to spite the Habsburgs and keep power in his own bloodline. It was a desperate final gamble to rewrite the future. And for a moment, it almost worked. In 1509, Germaine gave birth to a son named John. But the infant was weak and died within a few hours. They would never have another child. His gamble had failed. The Habsburg succession was safe, not because of treaties or laws, but because of the tragic death of a newborn baby. It proved in the end that there was no line Ferdinand would not cross. He had tried to use his daughter's grief to steal her kingdom, and when that was not enough, he had tried to replace her bloodline entirely. Ferdinand's final desperate gamble had failed. The Habsburg succession was secure. When Ferdinand died in 1516, it was Juana's son, Charles, who inherited everything, becoming the first king of a truly united Spain, and, soon after, the Holy Roman Emperor, Charles V, the most powerful man in the world. And his mother, the woman whose crown he now wore, remained his prisoner. For the next 39 years, Juana lived and breathed the silent, suffocating air of the palace at Tordesillas. The world outside changed beyond recognition. An empire was conquered in her name. A religious reformation tore Europe apart. But for Juana, time stood still. She was a queen in name only, a ghost haunting the halls of her own prison, her existence a closely guarded state secret. Her children grew up, ruled kingdoms, and had children of their own, but she would never see them. Her only companion remained her youngest daughter, Catherine, who was finally allowed to leave the palace to be married after 20 years of shared confinement. Finally, in April of 1555, at the age of 75, Juana died. She had been a prisoner for 46 years. She had outlived her parents, her husband, her siblings, and most of her own children. Her long, lonely vigil was over. And so, what became of her? What is the final, tangible legacy of the woman they called Juana the Mad? After her death, her body was first laid to rest in the convent at Tordesillas, the place of her long imprisonment. But her son, Charles, left instructions that she was not to remain there. She was to be moved, to be reunited with the man who had been the son of her soul. Today, if you go to the Royal Chapel of Granada, the magnificent mausoleum built by her parents, you will find 4 tombs. In one, Isabella and Ferdinand lie side by side, and in the other you will find Juana, Queen of Castile, finally and forever reunited in death with her husband, Philip the Handsome. After a lifetime of desperate, jealous pursuit, she is with him at last, their effigies carved in stone, sleeping peacefully for eternity. For me, this is the final, heartbreaking irony of her story. In the end, she got what she always wanted. So was she mad? Or was she a woman whose passionate heart was broken by a world that had no room for it? Her very real suffering cynically weaponized by every man who was supposed to protect her. At the end of the day, the diagnosis doesn't really matter. The tragedy of Juana la Loca isn't that she might have been ill. It's that her family, her court, and history itself found the story of her madness to be more useful and more interesting than the truth of her pain. She was a queen, a wife, and a mother, but the world only had room for the ghost story. And so, a ghost is what she became.